Hey, welcome listeners and panelists to Decoding Maori Cosmology with our special guest tonight, Laird Scranton, and our very own native New Zealander, Gary Cavanagh, aka God's a Cov's backyard. Now, this is Laird's fourth show with us on comparative cosmology, language and symbols, interconnecting many ancient civilizations throughout the world, including Dogon and other places like Skara Brae, places in Turkey, Egypt. He's been all over it with all of his books. In fact, I have a copy of Decoding Maori Cosmology. And
oh, you're the one who bought a copy.
yeah, you can pay me later. No. It's really good. It's one of his earlier books. Well, it's an early book, but it's succinct, to the point, and it does cover a lot of ground. And I'm really excited that he's here with us tonight. Laird has many books, podcasts. He's appeared on popular radio programs, and guest speaker at many symposiums, a guest lecturer, and you can actually see more of his biography on our Worldwide Crystal Network website at qfqcrystalnetwork.com, as well as on our video descriptions for previous shows we did with him, the last three that are on our playlist. So now Laird is also deeply involved in this field of comparative cosmology. And for a lot of our listeners who might not know this, it's actually a philosophy of creation of humanity. So he does an ongoing analysis of ancient language systems and their symbology, which in various cultures throughout time, and it enables us to learn more about the myths and symbols, words, and rituals of various cultures and how they understood many of the same elements. And when Laird matches up some of these core symbols that he has found in these different civilizations and gets him an understanding of how they were used in comparison with one another, and he triangulates on the original core meaning and teachings that predate organized religions in many cases. Now, there's not a whole lot of archaeological evidence to examine or documentation to evaluate in some cultures, especially in New Zealand. And that kind of limits your traditional mainstream archaeologists and anthropologists, historians, in their interpretation and collective perspectives. So Laird's research opens doors. Don't take this the wrong way, Laird, but I'm sure you've heard it many times. He opens the doorway to controversial understanding and ancient wisdoms that would not necessarily be looked at seriously or taught in traditional academics. I know I wasn't. So now that's Laird. Let's get a little bit about Gary going on here. Gary, my friend, it is so good to finally have you here on the show. It's been a while since we did our gardening video and our art show showing your work. But
yeah.
Oh, by the way, before I move on with Gary too much, there's some synchronicity here between you guys. You're both artists galore. Laird is not only a programmer and an author and studies cosmology, he's also a composer, a songwriter, and a performer. And he performs with his beautiful wife, Risa. They have a YouTube channel, Laird Scranton's YouTube channel. And if she's watching this later, or even if she isn't, please let her know. I fell in love with that song. Just take your time and say what you really mean. It just triggered me so, and I was like, oh my God, it's a beautiful song. And it was so significant to me that I shared it with someone that I really care deeply for.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
I really do. And her voice is just wonderful. And it's too bad you don't. I was like wanting more. I was like, there's like what, 6 or 7 videos out there of your performances and your compositions, and they're just beautiful.
Well, thank you.
So I don't think anybody knew that about you from your previous shows.
No, Teresa, we'll have to add them. We'll put some of the songs up on
his little splash there, just so people can see. That'd be
Yeah,
great.
he has a Laird Scranton YouTube
Yeah.
channel, and he has maybe what, half a dozen selected songs
Probably
there.
half a dozen songs that are on there that have been uploaded to there. I've
Yeah.
written quite a few on that over the years, but those are the ones I've shared so far.
Yeah. Well, they're
Awesome.
just fantastic, and I found them to be very moving,
Hmm.
and I really enjoyed them and shared that one out right away with my friends. So,
Well,
and
it's
I've got,
amazing how many of the researchers in this field, as you say, share computer skills, music skills,
yes, art.
Well, exactly.
language skills, things like that. Yeah.
Well, I guess because I didn't know you were an actual programmer, Laird.
Yeah.
Is that your background? Because I'm a computer programmer analyst.
For a couple of decades, we ran a mom and pop software company, custom software for about 200 businesses
Yeah.
around.
Yeah, because
US.
I've been a programmer since '79.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Same
that's
here.
great.
Yeah.
Same here.
Yeah,
Yep.
I did most of my career within the government, of course, that you don't get to see all the things we do, but and outside as well. I did consulting for
I
years.
had a very short program history as a programmer. I went into more of the end user requirements and became more of the business systems analyst and systems analyst. And I let everybody else do the programming because I didn't have the patience for programming. You know, I found out early on it wasn't my thing.
Yeah.
But I liked working with the programmers. You know, but now Gaza is a painter. He paints,
Wow.
and we're going to
Wow.
show some of his work tonight. But so that leads me to Gaza. Gary, a lot of you know him because he's in our community. He's appeared on different YouTube channels at different times. But he is a whole food, I call him a whole foods chef because he really knows his cooking and he knows how to do it with some of the best foods that are really good for you. Probably his wife's influence because she's an herbalist, Chinese herbalist.
Yeah.
And you should see their herb closet.
Crazy.
Wow.
He's got a super green thumb, a wonderful gardener, a permaculturist. So he does more than just your average gardening. He terraforms, if you will, the soil. He's incredibly gifted and talented artist, like I just said. He's also very much these days a political activist in his community, and very proud of what you did standing up in the origin there, Gary, for your community. And he's also a resource within his community. He gives away a lot. He helps people. And he's very curious about his land's history. And he has accumulated information over the years about not only about the native Maori culture and their possible impact on other cultures. He's also looked into other parts of history that suggest there was a lot going on there with a lot of different, like the tsunami in 1430, the Japanese junk boats that were washed ashore. And so I'm not going to take away your thunder, Gary. You're just the right person to have on here. It's not that Gary is related. He doesn't have DNA with the Maori people, but he is a born and raised in New Zealand, right, Gary? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, my great grandfather was from Ireland, and my great grandmother was from New York.
Ah. So see, those Celtic connections are going to be of interest to Gary too. Yeah. But now a lot of our viewers have never seen Gary because he's kind of quiet with all these things he's got going on. He doesn't go on to a lot of shows every day. But so for those of you, he talks a lot about healthy eating and growing a variety of edibles. You name it, he's got it. Much less his affinity for the wee little folks and fairies we've seen around his gardens.
Yep.
He has a little fairy pond there. But you're going to see in a moment here how heavily influenced at times his artwork is with this Maori culture, in my opinion. So, Gary, I'm sorry it took so long to get you on here to talk about this subject, but we were getting to know Laird. And I was looking for the right connection to talk reasonably about this so that you would have a platform to be able to share your knowledge and experiences with what you've researched. So I'm hoping that you and Laird connect on some things tonight, and I think it's going to be a really dynamite show. So Karen,
Yes.
things do take a while to happen, and they happen at the right times and for the right reasons. So we'd like to play a video that we featured on one of our programs with Gary's work. So hopefully Laird will see some things he recognizes.
Okay, perfect.
Took how long you're waiting for, before I knew what you were waiting for. A chance to question something obvious, a chance that something could come of this. Let's just take a while, let things take a while. Took a while of your coming around before I got the idea of your coming around. There's more to this than I had seen before. There's more to us than there has been before. And some things take a while, and some things take a while. And it's reassured by the time that you've let it be, to become this something of you and me. Let's just take a while. It's gonna take a while. It took the day you said to me A while.
That was cool.
It's cool seeing again. It's been a while. Yeah, did you recognize some things there, Laird? It's beautiful, Gary, and I like Samantha's music to that particular display of
That's
yours.
awesome.
Yes, you know, Risa would knock that song out of the park. That's the kind of song Risa sings. Yeah, she would knock that. Risa. Yeah, she would be. It would sound really nice with her voice too. Yeah.
No, very, very similar
Hmm.
voices. Yeah.
Well, so that brings us to, you see some of that influence of the symbology in his art. I recognized it right away. I didn't the first time around.
Yeah. No, absolutely.
Mhm.
Definitely beautiful paintings and beautiful imagery.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So guys, now you can see why we wanted to connect you two. So it makes a whole lot of sense. And, you know, there's just not a whole lot to go on in New Zealand. And I think by the end of this show, you're going to find out, folks, that we've all been told that New Zealand is one of the youngest countries in the world. We've been told that the people's presence there only dates back to when the Maori migrated from Polynesia in 1300s. But Laird has found it's even older than that, even as far back as 1100. But there's other evidence to suggest that there are other cultures and other inhabitants of New Zealand that predated possibly the Maori. And they have all kinds of drawings and carvings that were made by human hands, and yet archaeologists try to say it was all just washed ashore or part of the natural formation. So Laird, what led you to the Maori, to the study of the Maori? And
Well, actually, my Maori book was going to be the second book that I wrote. That was my intention, because I learned very early on, working with the Dogon symbolism, about a concept of called the Po. The Dogon have an outlook on the Po as a primordial component of matter. It compares to an atom. And I could see through references I had, that Elston Best's book, that the Maori concept of the Po was a match for the Dogon concept, and I knew that couldn't be coincidence. So from the outset, I knew there was a connection. That was just the entry point. I eventually learned that the Maori language is formulated on a lot of the same root syllables as the Dogon language. Words are put together the same way, so that in the Dogon language, you can predict what a word's meaning is going to be based on the syllables that it's comprised of. Each syllable corresponds to a concept like a symbol does. And so if you know how a word is pronounced, if you know what the original term was, you can infer from the original word what the meaning was. And Maori words are the same way. Just if I had no other reference but a Maori dictionary, I could have written an entire book about comparisons between the Maori and the Dogon.
wow,
Wow.
that's similar, huh?
Yes. Now, the Maori dictionary that I worked from is a comparative Maori Polynesian dictionary, and so many of the words have comparable meanings across Polynesian culture. So that expands the picture a little bit. Anywhere you have Polynesian culture, you have evidence of the same symbolic tradition.
I would point
Yeah,
out,
Dalbert?
I would point out something else that's really interesting about New Zealand. You pointed out that there's a relationship between the Maori language and the Dogon language, but if you look at the map, or specifically at a globe, New Zealand almost looks like it was stenciled on from Japan, because it's at exactly the same angle. It's also two islands, where the lower island is the bigger island and the top island is the smaller island. It's at the same latitude above the equator or below the equator, and it's roughly the same shape. And there's no real explanation for why that is the case.
Sounds like a TV playing in the background.
Right.
Did we lose Laird? There's some spooling there with Laird.
Yeah, interesting. Did you lose me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
You can hear me okay. No, I had never noticed the comparison between Japan and New Zealand before. That's very interesting. I'm not sure what kinds of synchronicities geological synchronicities could have created that, but it could be that the choice to go to New Zealand was affected by factors that are also pertinent in Japan, because the tradition I'm studying also is reflected in Japan.
Interesting. Interesting.
Also with Japan, they have the same vowels as the Maori language. So
The
they
same
have a-
vowels?
Yeah, the same vowels. They
Oh.
actually they can, because my ex-wife was a Japanese teacher, and even though she was German, she she explained to me that it was all for the Maori people. They could speak Japanese or learn it quite fast because of the vowels.
wow.
And the similarities then, sort of the same that you would have with French and Spanish, and as far as feminine, masculine. So there's going to be similarities that they can pick it up very quick, or some kind of connectedness between the two languages.
Right.
Well, also, they did a DNA search, and they've got DNA going to Taiwan.
Wow.
Wow. They actually
Wow.
traced it through the DNA, huh?
DNA into Taiwan, through
Oh.
the Pacific Islands into Taiwan. Yeah.
What's also interesting is that the people of Taiwan, they trace their genetic ancestry back to Madagascar. So it's like I'm sure you've heard of the connection that the Madagascar to Taiwan, and then from Taiwan to New Zealand, that was like the immigration trend. Because,
Well-
if anything, the history of mankind is a history of immigration.
Weren't
Right.
the Maori, though, believed DNA traced back to Polynesian cultures? And the Polynesians are influenced by the Asian, right?
Right.
Yeah, because they skipped over the islands.
So it all kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
If they,
So- In the North Island, right up the top, there's a cliff, and it's a suicide cliff. So when they wanted to go back home to, I think it was the islands, it was Hawaii. That's where it was directed, and they used to jump off the cliffs, and their soul will go back.
their soul would return to their homeland. Wow. Talk about taking yourself out of the game.
Yeah,
I cancel my contract.
yeah.
Wow. Well, see, folks, there is a way to do it.
Mm,
Anyway, so Laird, there's other connections there, though. There is that's similar to the Dogon, and that is their creation story. Their creation story of Father Earth and Mother Earth and Father Sky.
Right. Now, first of all, we have to be aware of the time frame difference. Most Dogon societal practices and symbolic references I work with date from around 3000 BC, and Maori culture doesn't, is closer to 1200 to 1300 AD. So there's the Dogon references are much further removed from Maori culture than we are from Maori culture, or the original Maori culture. So a lot happens over time, and with migrations and changes in languages and so forth. There's a lot that goes on. One of the key factors that's involved has to do with how can I say this? Segments of the epic of time from, if you imagine a Yuga cycle of 24 or 25,000 years, a half cycle is about 12,000 years. And the perspective is that midway through that cycle, there are reversals in symbolism that happen. So a lot of the Maori references, okay, one aspect we're familiar with that is the transition from matriarchy to patriarchy. In Egypt, we have, in almost every case where there's an Egyptian goddess, there's a counterpart god with a similar name who had all the same attributes. There are many other factors in ancient cultures that flip midway through the cycle. And so in Maori culture, we see that flip all the time, that a lot of the references are given in terms of masculine gods, but they pertain to feminine goddesses back in the archaic period of the tradition. So there's sort of a translation that has to be done there to make connections, and those have to be justified in certain ways. So
Okay.
it's tricky to try to make the connections. Language is one easy way to do it.
Okay, I can actually stop right there and actually do a geologic connection that you just did for me exactly in those time frames, because I actually
Uh-huh.
I specialize in catastrophic geology, and it's interesting that you would do the feminine to masculine, the patriarchal to matriarchal, exactly in the 11,000 or half that cycle. That's like clockwork as far as our polar shifts from, that complete flip. So, and it happens like clockwork every around 11,068 years. So that to me coincides exactly what you just said as far as the shift between that, the cultures. And you have said something else there too, Laird. It was, you said a flip between not only masculine and feminine, but something else you said too.
There are other factors that flip. Well, going along with your geology perspective, prior to around 3200 BC, prior to maybe 2600 BC at the latest, the Orkney Island region has associations with concepts of the underworld in Egypt and in ancient Greece and other places. At the point where the Maori arrived in New Zealand, underworld symbolism is associated with New Zealand. As a matter of fact, I think the ancient name for New Zealand literally means first circle of the underworld. So we have that kind of a flip too, that this is the symbolic location of where they place geographically the real world counterpart to the underworld shifts from north to south in the same time frame.
Same thing.
Wow.
So that same cyclical pattern of that around 11,000 years, almost 12,000 years exactly.
Right.
So not only is it physical manifestation within our physical world, geologic, it's also within our consciousness and collective consciousness, our languages and so on, with that actual occurrence of that opposite of our duality or flip within our reality.
Now we have cultures all over the world who are making these flips in symbolism at all approximately the same era. Cultures that are widespread who are not thought to have had any contact with each other, suddenly at the same moment in prehistory or in history, they're choosing to substitute one set of symbols for the other set of symbols, or one set of burial practices for a previous set, or one form, architectural form of houses for another architectural form. All these things flip in about the same time frame. The way I explain that is, the example I use is of taking a cross-continental flight. I think I've used this with you before, that everyone on the flight, chances are, doesn't know anybody else on the flight, or not more than one or two people. And they probably don't communicate with each other on the flight. But when the plane lands, they all know to change their watches. This is the same thing with these cycles, that they've all been educated in what the cycle is, and so they know at the appropriate time that there's a certain change that has to occur symbolically, and then they make it.
Another really good example of reversal of meaning would be, for example, the pentagram. The pentagram was actually one of the first symbols of Christianity, symbolizing the 5 wounds of Christ. Only later was Christianity symbolized by a cross.
Right, and we can actually see a transition in the Hebrides, south of Orkney. The original symbolism at 3600 BC on Orkney was to the concept of a sleeping goddess. All of the original houses at the Skara village were built to a particular plan, and that the Dogon also built stone houses to the same plan with some matching architectural elements that are significant. And for the Dogon, the plan represents the body of a sleeping woman or a sleeping goddess.
Mm-hmm.
So that form carries forward. And there's a period of time on one of I think it's the Isle of Lewis in the Hebrides, where there has survived a form of the early Christian cross that is also recognizable as the form of this sleeping goddess. So you can actually see the transition happen between the ancient tradition and Christianity.
Amazing. And now didn't they do a modification though to the sleeping goddess structure. She was pregnant, and they took the womb out.
That's hard to say. The sleeping goddesses was made famous by in Malta at the site of the Hal Sophliene Hypogeum. It's an underground set of caves that were turned into, were transformed in architecturally, some of it into stonework halls inside this hill. Now, one of the mysteries about that, excuse me, about that site is that the original researchers who discovered the site, the entryway to it was through the top of the hill, in a village that sat at the top of the hill. And the researcher back in like 1910 expressed confusion that in the Maltese language, Hal Sophliene means low-lying village. And he wondered why would they name this site low-lying village when it's, you enter it through a village at the top of the hill. That didn't make sense to him. But if you look instead to the ancient Faroese language in Orkney, Hal Sophliene means cave or hall of the sleeping one.
That's amazing.
Virtually every founding element on Orkney Island at 3600 BC or before, you find in similar form on Malta immediately prior to that. So there's lots of reason to think that the first farmers on Orkney came from Malta and brought the sleeping goddess concept with them.
It's interesting because Malta is actually the only country in Europe that has a Semitic language. The Maltese language is actually Semitic, similar to Hebrew.
Right, and Malta ends up being a connecting point back to, earlier symbolic traditions in the Near East. Go back to Tepe and places like that.
How do you know where to triangulate and connect the dots in terms of what came first, the chicken or the egg? I mean, they're all interrelated. They're all interconnected, but they're at different.
They are, but there's certain elements that become sort of tipping points or signatures. For example, on Orkney Island at around 3600 BC, or actually around 3200 BC, at a place called the Ness of Brodgar, one of the artifacts they've excavated there was an intact skeleton of an aurochs, which was a mammoth bull. Now, researchers know that Orkney was a very peaceable community, a very peaceable place at that time. It's not imaginable that anyone would have brought a wild aurochs into that community, because it would literally have been a bull in a china shop. There would have been no stopping the destruction it would have wreaked. So it had to have been a domesticated aurochs, but there are only two places in the world where aurochses were ever domesticated. One was in Anatolia, and the other one was along the north coast of the Mediterranean. So that kind of a factor points us into a positive direction. It limits us. It says the only place an aurochs could have originated and been brought to Orkney from would have been one of those two places. So that points us to the Mediterranean, and it points us to Anatolia. Those are the kinds of factors that you can follow that insist that this particular thing came before that particular thing.
I know we're skipping around, but this is fascinating. Gaza, your wife, does she still practice, or has she practiced a form of Buddhism?
No, she's Taoism. Yeah.
Taoism, okay.
Yeah. So it's Tao, like Tao. Yeah. So her family in Taiwan have a temple on their land, so that's where she was brought up on the temple. So, and the temple was inside their house. It's just pretty cool.
Wow,
that's pretty cool. Yeah.
She was raised up in that, so she's quite spiritual. But
did she find any connections to the practices of the spiritual beliefs and practices of the Maori?
No. So she was curious. Yeah, no. She's like when she came over here, she didn't know anything about that sort of stuff. So she wasn't interested in that sort of stuff, and she was just focused on the growth in tell.
Mhm.
And yeah, so and that was her small world. And then when she met me, I opened her eyes to
It was
everything.
fireworks, Gary.
Yeah, absolutely. And but when she was over here, she got involved in Steiner as well, which she believes that
Awesome. Yeah.
it's very, very similar. Yeah. So
Well,
and anthroposophy. So she's studying that now. Well, we both are. You know, we go on so Friday nights.
awesome. Yeah, I knew you were still going with her to places like that's why I was wondering what it was. Because I'm telling you, chapter 6 of this book blew me out of the water. Chapter 6.
Mm.
And it's the pre-Buddhist and Hindu influences on the Maori religion. And I know Laird will touch on that, but it's about ascension. Got an echo here, but it's about ascension and how they viewed it from the Buddhist perspective. So, Laird, can you tell us about that? Because I think it's like spot on.
Well, one of the confusions in New Zealand about possible connections to Hinduism is that there are some artifacts that look like early Hindu artifacts or Tamil artifacts, but there's no evidence, no direct evidence of any of the traditional Hindu deities. Now, that's not entirely true because I know there are certain stone placements on New Zealand that are traditionally painted red, and that's a Hindu practice that's associated with Ganesha, the elephant god. So there are elements on New Zealand that could theoretically be reflective of Hindu deities. But my perspective is that Hinduism and the Maori tradition in New Zealand share a common ancestor that preceded the organization and formation of Hinduism or of Buddhism. And so they have a lot of the same founding elements and same founding philosophies and principles, but they don't have the same developed structure. Hinduism doesn't reflect any of the Maori deities in the same form, and neither does New Zealand of Hinduism. So it's a tricky question because every researcher has their own set of preconceptions that they don't really want to violate.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And so any statement you're going to make is going to step on some toes, and so it's automatically controversial.
Well, here's the paragraph that just the cosmological concept of ascension is one that is central to the practice of Buddhism, and according to the parallel creational themes of the cosmology, the term can be applied to the spiritual growth of a person, to the progressive stages by which matter is conceptually raised up, and to a concept of ascension in the larger universe by which an ostensible gateway or door can be reached between our material universe and its ostensible non-material paired universe. But there's some terminology here that is common. If we skip down to discussed in the context of a more worldly frame, the concept of ascension can be expressed in terms of efforts by a person to reach the top of a mountain. Still echoing. In Buddhism, a central aspect of ascension is defined by the word Sakti, S-A-K-T-I, a term that relates to a kind of spiritual energy that emanates from the region of a person's navel and rises upward. However, the phenomenon is not vocalized in Maori words, so no direct phonetics can be offered for the Buddhist term Sakti. However, Traeger defines a Maori term for ascend as keke, K-A-K-E, kaki, kaki, a word that is arguably within the same phonetic ballpark as Sakti, kaki, Sakti. It means to ascend, to climb upward, and to excel or rise above others. So phonetically, there's some comparison there, but it has the same meaning, ascend.
Right. And for any given word, when we make a comparison like that, at best, it's suggestive because we're not in a position to be able to trace any kind of a linguistic etymology for the words. And so a linguist wouldn't accept the comparison. They would say, look, you haven't supported this based on linguistic principles.
Yeah.
However, in the field of comparative cosmology, we have other ways of correlating things, and normally it's done through clusters of things that belong together. For instance, if we have deities in two different traditions that hold comparable places in the pantheon of gods and perform similar acts and have names that are phonetically similar and are associated with similar icons and so forth, you accumulate enough different factors that are corresponding to each other that you can make a legitimate argument for a correlation. That's especially true with cosmological words that carry multiple meanings that are sort of discrete from each other. And so one of the ways of making a linguistic argument without, making a language argument without sort of outside of the context of traditional linguistics is through these clusters of meanings. The Maori language is far enough removed in time from the languages I'm working with that, again, the best you usually come up with is a suggestive connection, not a definitive one.
Thank you. I was just so curious. I was like, wow. Because the idea of them being exposed to Buddhism. Go ahead, Gary.
They tried to get rid of the Māori language, and you weren't allowed to speak it in New Zealand for a long, long time, and they nearly succeeded. And
in what era did they make that attempt?
Just in the 1900s, yeah.
Okay. Really,
so from the 1800s to the 1900s, up until when I was going to school, they were only introducing it into the schools to be taught. Wow. And the reason for that is they had to, because the Mormons were one of the first ones to come to New Zealand as well, and they learned the Māori language and wrote it down because the Māoris didn't have a written language. So they wrote it all down and took it back to America, and so they ended up going to America to get their language back. Yeah,
oh, interesting.
So they saved the language.
Okay, I'm going to throw something out too, just because of what Teresa said and because of my background. And you talked about ascension as far as and the belly button. Well, if you go back into older cultures and far back in my tradition, as far as the Toltec and my knowledge, well, that's exactly the same thing. And what they call the belly button, what they're describing here is what they call is the assemblage point. It's our assemblage point.
Okay.
So here you are talking about exactly the same thing in this book from what you talked about, the Buddhism and everything else. And then I can go back all the way to the Toltecs and what you're describing, exactly the same thing in their tradition. But like I said, the belly button area is called your assemblage point of energy, and where we focus everything out from that point, and including going to your higher self and ascension and everything else stems from your assemblage point, which is around the belly button area.
That's great. Well, there's some relationships here, some basic relationships that I should probably spell out because they affect our understanding of all this stuff.
Yes, my background went away.
Go ahead.
Okay. There are a few principles I should talk about, a few parallels I should talk about before we go on any farther, because it'll make discussion of some of these topics a little easier and a little more understandable. When the Dogon talk about concepts of creation, when they talk about creation, they're talking about how the universe forms, how matter forms, how biological life comes about, and how consciousness comes about. And they say that there's a single set of dynamics of energy that are responsible for all those four things. So to underscore that, they've created a symbolic tradition where there's a single progression of symbols that simultaneously describe all four of those themes. And so that makes each symbol a little more complicated, because you have to consider not just what the symbol means. You can't really ask, what does this symbol mean? You have to ask, what does it mean if we're talking about biology? Or what does it mean if we're talking about matter? Or what does it mean if we're talking about consciousness? So that's the first thing, is that there are multiple levels of meaning to each of the symbols. So a navel or a belly button can refer to different things in different contexts. The second thing is that the tradition was first expressed in written form in a philosophy called Samkhya in India. And Samkhya is a companion to yoga. Samkhya is the cosmological viewpoint of the principles. Yoga is a personalized viewpoint of the same energetics. And to the point that each of the key cosmological terms also have meaning for yoga. So the idea of energy ascending, through the chakras and out the head is part and parcel of the same complex ball of symbolism we're talking about, because these are all parallel structures based on all the same ideas. So when we realize that, then we're not too surprised that we have an intermix of discussion about chakras and navels and ascension at the same time that we're talking about how the universe comes about.
Wow.
So now Maori culture,
how the universe, or just how matter gets created into this reality? Like
both.
The same thing.
Okay. What the system ultimately rests on is a handful of principles of what energy does, and those principles recur as a cluster on all levels, from the tiniest quantum level to the largest macro level. So if you understand how that energy works at any of those levels, you can apply that knowledge to the other levels. So if we're talking about Big Bang era, we're working with all the same dynamics of energy as if we're talking about how a spiral of matter emerges, or if we're talking about how consciousness emerges. It's all the same energy.
Sort of.
As a matter of fact,
you'd have to believe in the Big Bang theory to begin with, though, too. That's just a matter of perception, consciousness, and collective. And there's another whole realm of science with the electric universe that actually have debunked the whole Big Bang theory, actually, just to let you know.
Right. But yes, no.
So it's settled science, unsettled science. I don't know.
No, when you say that, what I hear you say is, okay, imagine you're standing at the bottom of a hill next to a road that runs up the hill and over the top of the hill into the distance. And at the furthest point in the distance is where the top of the hill is, and to your eyes, it looks, if you look at the road, it looks like the sides of the road converge together to a point at the top of the hill. Now, if we use math to interpret that, we're going to calculate a singularity at the top of the hill, which is what Big Bang is.
Yeah, but I can't say we went the right direction with math.
No,
as far as let's not get into that. That's another whole.
No, let me finish this. Let me finish this because it's important to what you're saying. I'm agreeing with what you're saying. There's another way of approaching the problem. You can approach it as a problem of distance and direction.
Yes.
And if you do that, then what happens is you learn what's over the hill.
Mm-hmm.
Using math as the primary tool creates some problems. And so the Dogen is saying you can't use math as your primary tool. You can use math to verify certain things.
That's correct. So I agree with you. That's where we diverged into maybe not so much true science, is when we moved into the mathematical representation of our world and our scientific realm. As far
right, because
so that's where we diverged.
If we're talking about changes in the pace of time, I could say that in a particular era in the past, time ran 1,000 times more quickly than it does now, or 10,000 times more quickly, or 100,000 times more quickly, or 1,000,000 times more quickly.
Of course, because you have to know what time is then, and time is transfer rate within the matrix. So so it varies.
I would never hit a divide by zero problem. If I approach it with math, it reaches a point where the numbers get so small that you end up with a divide by zero problem, or they get so large that you have an infinity.
Well, you get into Planck's constants and things like that, but yeah.
Well, it's true what you guys said. You can't use mathematics to figure out the nature of reality, simply because since we're talking about settled science, quote unquote, gravity, is it a push or a pull? Is it the push of ethereal particles, or is it the pull of gravity? Either way,
or is it just
change? The math wouldn't change either way.
Or is gravity just a subset or an outcome of magnetics? actually.
I
And
can explain to you.
subset of electricity. So
I can explain to you what gravity is from the perspective of the Dogon if you want to hear it.
okay,
Yes.
Sure.
sure.
Okay. See if I can explain this in a direct way. Okay. From the Dogon perspective, as energy spins and it evokes relativistic mass, time frame is being slowed, according to Einstein. That if you increase acceleration or increase mass, you're slowing time frame. From the Dogon perspective, those differences in time frame are comparable. They're comparable to differences in water pressure create buoyancy. That if I were to take a buoyant object to the bottom of a swimming pool, let go of it, it's going to naturally gravitate to the domain of least pressure. If I take a body of mass and let go of it, it's going to gravitate to the domain of slowest time frame from the Dogon perspective. And in both cases, what we're looking at is a push. Now that is less obvious from the perspective that we see things from, but when you understand that we have a handful of dynamics of energy and you start ratcheting those down dimensionally as you move down from 4 dimensions to 3 to 2 to 1 and into the quantum domain, at each stage you're simplifying your view of what happens with those dynamics of energy. They don't change, but your view of them is simplified. It's the same way that a picture of a square is a simpler picture than a picture of a cube. So the further down the scale you go, the clearer picture you get of what the actual dynamic is. The further up the scale you go, the more detailed a view of how you get of how they interact with each other. And so you need the whole continuum to be able to understand what's going on. But if you carry the question of gravity down to that lowest level, you discover that gravity is absolutely a push. And what it begins with...
Okay, well, let's stop. You're not really saying anything, really, to me, except gravity is a push, but you're not really describing it. And what I would say is a push is what you're getting is magnetics.
Your explanation
Think
makes
about
sense.
think about magnetics and what magnetics
I'm
is
agreed.
as far as the push or repelling or forces.
I'm agreed.
that
Let me
works.
explain to you how it's magnetics. I'm in agreement with you.
Yeah.
At the root domain is energy in a state of superconductivity. At least that's the state that is the starting point for the evocation of matter. It's a superconductive situation where electricity flows unresisted and magnetism is dormant. Magnetic flux is dormant. Now, every so often, randomly, or as a result of an input of energy, the circuit of electricity gets disrupted. And when that happens, a spark is created. A spark is a monopole of electricity.
That's
and that raises the flow of electricity, electrical current in that superconductive domain in that little locality above the threshold to awaken two monopoles of magnetism, what become a north and south pole. And with the input of energy, you cause those magnetic poles to flip. And when they flip, they carry the point charge of electricity with it. And once they've flipped, they're sitting anti-parallel to the rest of the domain of magnetism, and they get pushed out.
That's right.
That push is where gravity comes from.
Ah.
And what it boils down to is a difference in time frame between what's experienced in the superconductive domain as opposed to what's experienced by those monopoles. From the Dogon perspective.
From the Dogon perspective, right. Mm-hmm. That was their understanding. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so no, that's exactly
theoretically, anytime you would have like a celestial body passing on another celestial body, that interaction would create electricity or electrical current between them, which you could potentially harness, which means we could be harnessing free energy just from the interaction of the Earth versus the sun.
Right.
Based on that, what you just said.
Yeah, I agree completely. No, I think we're on the same page in terms
Yeah.
of what it boils down to. The Dogon provide us with a why, and they provide us with a starting point that we can trace the rest of it from in a scientifically reasonable way, that it starts here and here's how and why at each stage it continues.
Mhm.
And the net continuum is a superconductor to superinsulator phase transition. It's considered to be the perfect example of a quantum coherent phase transition. That's under the covers. That's what's going on with everything. That's what's going on with dipole action. That's what's going on. Actually, ultimately, that's what's going on with consciousness. I just discovered the details of that today, how that works and how and why it works. It's what's going on with water. It's what's going on with biology because of water.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, now I was talking about the spark of energy evoking two magnetic poles that get ejected from the superconducting domain, and so you're self differentiating a material domain from a superconductive domain. Those three monopoles interact with each other in a way that is directly comparable to the three atoms in a water molecule. Their dynamic is ultimately the same as a water molecule.
Mm-hmm.
And so the Dogon are saying that the underlying plan for energetics in the universe is water. If you go to water, they've discovered there are two forms of water. There's a coherent high density water, and there's a less coherent low density water. And the energetic interaction between those two modes of water in any random body of water is exactly the same as interaction of energy between non-materiality and materiality in the universe. It's the same dynamic. Understand it in one place and you can recognize it in the other.
Yeah, because you have to have that back and forth, negative, positive, to have movement, to have creation of any kind. If we didn't have that, we wouldn't even have creation. So you have to have that movement. So
yeah. Life is motion.
Life is motion, and you have to have that negative, positive, back and forth, and that to make creation.
Now, what happens is that down at the superconductive domain, what creates the condition of superconductivity is the perfectly ordered alignment of magnetic north and south poles in a particular direction. And that facilitates the unresisted flow of electricity, which is the superconductive state. That state naturally tends to evoke or to transition to a superinsulating state where the reverse is true, that magnetism is uninfluenced by electricity and electricity is dormant. Each one has the natural propensity to evoke the other one, and so you end up getting this cycle. It's the same cycle as the in-out cycle of a dipole that is persistent, and it goes on. It will continue without an input of additional energy. It's perpetual.
It's perpetual.
Yeah, so that would be
that's why you have
kind of
perpetual energy with magnetics. Yeah.
Yeah, so that would be kind of the same the same phase transition as you have in like the photon, which behaves as a particle and as a wave alternately, which switches between particle and wave.
Right. So now the entire symbolic system of the Dogon, I would say Dogon / Egyptians, because all the same ideas are reflected in Egyptian hieroglyph symbols and Egyptian language and Egyptian cosmology. The whole thrust of the tradition is
Audio.
Yeah.
He
lost his thing again.
Lost his sound.
Audio.
Okay, there.
Go.
Oh.
The Dogon are saying, what's that?
Your sound is cutting in and out.
That's probably, I don't know if it's our fault or not.
That's okay. Just keep going.
Okay, what the Dogon describe in the universe are 14 superposed universes. But what they're really describing is conceptually no different than the domains that self-differentiate in deep sea water for life forms. If you in deep sea water, deep ocean water, you'll discover certain life forms prefer the conditions at the bottom of the ocean, and all the way up the scale, there are zones that differentiate themselves naturally that lend themselves to particular forms of life and particular conditions based on how much sunlight gets through and what temperature it is and what water pressure it is and other factors like that. The Dogon are saying that in the universe, that's what's happening also, that by factors of 10, there are resonances that create conceptual boundaries between 14 domains of energy in the universe that run from gamma rays that are associated with the Big Bang to microwaves and radio waves at the other end of the scale. And each of these, the electromagnetic spectrum, as it's understood by science, documents literally what the Dogon are describing. They're exactly the same configurations of energy.
How do the Maori view that energy?
The Maori don't get down into the details of it. The Maori tradition is didn't preserve the kind of detail that the Dogon and the Hindu and the Buddhist traditions and the Egyptian traditions preserved. So we see sort of elements of that. We see the words that I know describe that situation, but I'm not deep enough into the Maori tradition to know whether the innermost Maori priest understands the innermost meanings of their own symbols. They might.
Let me ask you this. When you were doing your research and you noticed that a lot of these earlier civilizations, the farmers, they went from hunter-gatherer to growing crops, and when you look at Skara and how they were living and the Dogon and others, do you get the same feeling with the Maori that they were a school of knowledge, that they brought with them traditions from the same school of knowledge that you find at these other places?
Yes, and we can demonstrate that based on what the traditional Maori village schools.
Okay.
They're teaching the same subjects that the Dogon say were instructed anciently. They're doing it using the same form of a school, physical form of a school architecture that you find all over Ireland. There are thousands of these structures that are horseshoe-shaped structures that researchers in Ireland don't know what they were for. But I know because of the Maori references, they were schools. The name actually tells us in Ireland that it was a school if you look to the Faroese language as the root source. Anytime you have a word, an ancient word that the researchers tell you, well, the etymology is uncertain, that says to me that they've been looking at the wrong language to try to interpret the word. If you go to the Faroese language or to the Dogon language or the ancient Egyptian language, you discover what the actual meaning was.
Yeah, I just wonder.
The system of schools runs all the way back to Orkney. The classic example of it is a site called the Barn House on Orkney.
Yep.
And it's memorialized in Buddhist culture. They created a school at a place called Vulture Peak, which is not the original Vulture Peak, but it's a memorializing Vulture Peak, where the school is honorific of the structure on Orkney. And you can trace the tradition back up through the Faroe Islands and into Scandinavia, Iceland and Scandinavia at around 3300 BC with in fairly positive ways. It's all the same system of schools.
Well, maybe Gary can shed some light on this. Gary, I found some documentation and photographs of these boulders that were very much like the boulders that you'll find in Ireland, even today, different parts of Great Britain, where they did ceremony rituals. They carved bowls into the size of these boulders and smoothed them out. They chiseled them out, smoothed them out. And the practice was to take your right hand, going in a clockwise direction when you want to put out intents for healing or a manifestation for something positive in someone's life. And the reverse is true. If you take your left hand and put it in there and spin it to the left, you're actually bringing down a curse on someone. That's a very Celtic tradition, and they found these boulders under layers of ash when they were putting in some of those roadways there in southeastern New Zealand.
Yeah.
And they relocated those boulders, but a lot of archaeologists say, no, they're just natural wearing.
Yeah, that's what they said. Yep. Yeah.
It's like
They're all over the place. They're all over the
identical.
place. Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, they're round. I've seen them myself. Yeah.
So that's one example. Then there's the standing stones. The standing stone is another example of a
Yeah. And then
Celtic.
Yeah, there's also a wall.
The wall. Yeah.
Yeah, the wall.
Yeah, the white, the Kaimanana wall or whatever it's called. Yeah, they still
they
don't
say
have
it's
a date
natural,
for
but
that. It's not natural. They can't date it because
well, you
it's
know
stone.
why? You know what they're saying? The geologists are saying they're natural settling, that they actually busted and broke apart in these perfectly
sure they
megalithic
did.
type.
Sure.
I mean,
sure
they look
did.
like they were without mortar. They were stacked and cut.
Yeah.
Were you gonna say something, Larry?
Well, I'm friendly with Robert Schoch, who is a geologist from Boston University.
Right.
And he asserts that there are geological conditions under which you can create formations that look like they were man-made that aren't. And so it becomes very tricky to distinguish, were the right geological forces in play at that place to have produced that result and not have it been man-made. But at very least, it's suggestive. It's really highly suggestive, and it's a reason for someone to research it. And to blow it off and say, well, it couldn't possibly be man-made doesn't make any sense to me.
There's another group of boulders. They're completely round and smooth. They're about 2 or 3 feet tall. They're huge. They weigh a ton. Yeah. And they're smooth. And they're on strategic peaks of different mounds or high elevation points, almost mountains in New Zealand. This is again in the south, right, Gary, southeast?
Yeah.
And if you stand on the top of one of these mounds and get an angle to another point, there's another boulder over there. So you go over that mountaintop and you get an angle, and there's another boulder over there, and they're all perfectly round and strategically placed, it appears.
So they seem to have an alignment. They're all aligned.
They seem to have a map or an alignment. Now the geologists are saying, oh, well, they just washed ashore during one of the tsunamis or a catastrophic event, and they were deposited in these places. I'm like,
Yeah, but
and
they find the same stones in the Yucatan Peninsula and in Belize. They have the same exact stone balls that are like perfectly round to within a thousandth of an inch or something like that, in specific regions of Central America.
Well, Costa Rica is famous. I saw them myself.
They tried to say the same thing about those
They're all
boulders.
over in Costa. No.
They tried to say the same thing about those boulders, Gary, that they moved from, that were hidden in the ash, that have the ceremonial. There are human carving. They're carvings made by human hand.
Yeah.
And some of those is the serpent, the figure of the serpent, Laird.
Yeah, the taniwha. Yeah.
Yeah. So that suggests that no, they didn't just wash ashore as part of a. They actually show that there was a pre-culture there of some kind.
Right.
Yeah.
And the serpent.
In the South Island, we had the Morioris. Yeah, so the South Island had the Moriori, so they were there first, and then the Māoris came along and they hunted them and killed them, and they said they ate them, but I don't believe that.
That's the pre-Maori society, right?
Yeah.
Pre-originals.
Yeah, they were originals, yeah. And then on the North Island, you had the Vikings, and so they taught the Māoris how to fight, and that's why they were. When the English came over, they were fierce. They were fierce warriors because the Vikings actually taught them.
But
they found like their boats and shields and swords and helmets and everything. So so they were influenced by the Vikings as well.
Okay, so yeah, you have You have documentation for some of that, don't you? You
Yeah,
should
it
hook
was
up,
in the museum.
hook
Yeah,
up
it was
with
in the
Karen
museum.
on that, you know.
Mm.
Because he has photographs and documentation on that.
Oh,
This
that
was
looks
a
awesome. Yeah, Gary will
Yeah.
add it to the whole, details
Maori
about the
story,
whole story. Yeah, that
Mhm.
I keep
Yeah.
track of and post.
Definitely, Gary.
Yeah.
I pulled a few together, but not any of that. So we'd like to compare notes and pull that together. But Laird, what I noticed was the lizard
Right.
and the snake symbology, and I'm just like looking at it. I'm going, that is so Dogon. But I mean, I'm sure it's other cultures as well, of course, like
Mhm.
Central America.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
it just shows the influence of a common school of
Right.
teaching that they're still following in some of their, as I understand it, their Maori tradition. Still, they've kept the goddess concept. They've kept there's a photograph I didn't get to show it because we couldn't do a share screen. We'll put it on the website, but it shows Father Sky, Mother Earth, and he breathes life into her. She becomes the mother of all things on the planet. That sounds very familiar to me. That whole story of creation.
Right. Now, from the perspective of the Dogon and the Buddhists and some others, we're looking at an intentionally instructed system, a civilizing plan for humanity that was closely interwoven with a symbolic cosmology. The idea was that to adopt objects and practices of daily life to represent certain things symbolically, so that every time a person came out of their hut and saw that thing, it would reinforce what they learned in their school.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
But Laird, I could say that this stand for my phone is a phone stand, and that's how I recognize it. Okay. But
Okay.
another culture on the other side of the world might see it as something else.
Right.
But yet
So-
these people are all seeing it as a phone stand.
Right. Now, one of the big problems faced by this group of teachers was they were trying to preserve intimate details of a very scientific system, but the tools they had to convey that forward down through the generations were untechnological cultures, non-technological cultures. So the target audience was really us. It was really aimed at a society that could recognize a scientific shape when they see it and know what it represents.
Mm-hmm.
So the trick was, because they were aiming so far down the road from where they were, the trick was to try to couch these meanings and metaphors that were going to still resonate however many thousands of years later, 10, 11,000 years later. How do I choose a metaphor? Only works if you're trying to teach me something and you pick a metaphor to convey it intuitively to me.
Yeah.
That only works if I have the reference of the thing you're comparing to. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and it's very simple if you have two things that are alike. It's very simple if you have two things that are opposite. You can immediately convey an idea to me if you say, well, hot is the opposite of what cold is. You know what cold is. Hot is the opposite of that. And I immediately get it. Okay, so these teachers were faced with the problem of how do we choose the right metaphor that's still going to resonate thousands of years from now with a technological audience. And so to hedge their bets, they picked multiple metaphors. They expressed every idea in multiple ways in terms of how a seed grows into a plant, or how
covering all the bases.
the domains of the animal kingdom from
Yeah.
insects to birds. They pick things in the natural world, but multiple sets of natural metaphors, and all of these ideas are expressed redundantly in terms of these multiple metaphors.
Okay.
And
now,
so
I think that there's something. Is it okay to cut? I didn't mean to be rude. Were you
no,
almost
it's okay.
okay?
No,
The
that's fine.
because of the lag that I have but I'm thinking of something more deeply spiritual, and I've been saying all along that, and for those of us who understand and have an affinity or a connection with Native American, will understand what I'm getting ready to say, and even with the Indigenous peoples of different places, certain animals, certain beings give off a certain kind of energy. And we recognize that energy.
Right.
The energy of the lizard is very different from the energy of the frog. And the energy of the frog is very different than the energy of the turtle. And yet we attract those that we vibe with, and they become totem guides or spirit guides to us when they select us or come across our path. So it seems to me that cultures throughout these cycles, time and different locations, they were all able to tune into the frequency and energy of what that symbol represented. So it's almost like a language or an alphabet. The lizard has a certain meaning. The snake has a certain meaning in all these cultures, and it's the same meaning.
Right.
Yeah, I totally understand what Laird
The
is talking
spiritual
about. With,
language.
you know, this being like a civilizing plant for all of humanity that was passed down through all the generations, with
Mhm.
universal symbolism attributed to certain animal forms, like for example the snake.
Right.
That's usually in the shape of a perfect sine wave, right? So
Right.
the other interesting animal that you find in most cultures that does not exist is the dragon.
Right.
In other words, some type of lizard-like
China,
creature
yeah.
that breathes fire.
Right.
So,
Well,
Yeah,
what's
from
the
my
well,
perspective,
significance of that?
remember that part of the goal here was for the average person who's been instructed in this tradition to see the symbols in their daily life. And so certain symbols had to be customized a little bit depending on where the person came from. You know, in North America, the serpent symbol is a rattlesnake most often. In India, it's a cobra.
Mm-hmm.
Depending on where you are, the symbols, you know, adjust themselves just a little
Yeah.
bit to the
Their
reality.
frequency, their frequency.
For me, dragons in China most often carry the same symbolism as the serpent does in Egypt.
There's something else I noticed
Mhm.
too. When religions came about, when certain groups of people started deitizing and worshiping these things, sometimes the meaning changed. They changed the frequency of the symbols. So the universal language shifted with the way their thoughts shifted. And the ones that have preserved those original meanings are the Dogon, and it seems like the Maori still follow that original
Yes.
spiritual teaching. They've managed to protect their memory of that, their gnosis of that, whereas others mutilated it, twisted it, contorted it, the true meaning
Right.
of these symbols.
Each culture preserves details that got dropped in other cultures. And so, you know, as I was going through my progression of studies, I would find things that I knew were significant, but looked like a loose end, say for the Dogon or for the Egyptians or for the Buddhists, whoever.
Mm-hmm.
Eventually, you come along to another culture like ancient China or the Maori or cultures in other places, and you suddenly realize that they preserve that theme in its entirety. You know, that the reason the mulberry bush is important is explained in China. It's not explained. The Dogon know it's important, but they don't explain why.
Mm-hmm. Now I'm getting somewhere with this though too. So now, having said those two things, what I'm wondering is when these shifts occurred, Karen, when these cycles of time change that you started talking about at the very beginning,
Right.
and when they went from feminine to masculine, is that when the religions came about around the same time where they started formalizing? Do you remember?
Okay, I'm trying to remember what your specific question was.
I was saying these changes and shifts in
Right.
from going from creating a religion around the energies that they were and the
Right.
knowledge they were originally teaching was spiritual
Okay,
concepts became a religion. Is that when the energy, did it coincide with changes in cycles?
The midpoint in the energetic half cycle, if couple of ways of knowing what it is. The Hebrew calendar is approaching
1,000 years.
it's approximating 6,000. It's like 5780 something at this point.
Yeah.
Is the Hebrew. So it looks to me as if the Hebrew calendar was established at the midpoint of the half cycle. So around 3600 BC, which is the same era that the Orkney instruction was happening. Now, from my perspective, the first round of instruction happens around 9000 BC at Göbekli Tepe. There are some other sites I can identify along the route from there. Okay, there's a path of transmission down through Pakistan and India that extends as far as Australia. That involves the Shakti cult. There's a path of transmission that extends down through Palestine and into Egypt. And there's a path of transmission that around 6000 BC starts to deliberately cross the Mediterranean. Researchers in the Mediterranean recognize that someone was deliberately colonizing major islands for agriculture, and they were doing it with the same clusters of elements that we see on Orkney when farmers arrived there. It's like a deliberate attempt to colonize.
That almost sounds like what they refer to as the mystery schools, where this was like a secret inner tradition that pretty much served as the undercurrent to all the culture and religion, and it spread itself. Yeah.
Right.
So
Do you remember the story of the 12 travelers? In all the cultures, there was always 12.
Right. 12 disciples.
The disciples, yeah. You find that in all of the cultures. They're going out after a major cataclysmic event to bring humanity back in tune with the teachings.
Yeah, but very recently, I would say about 1700 years ago, we also had like a transformational shift in the various religions, most notably Christianity, which became more authoritative, and it went from the Christian went from a follower of Christ to being a worshiper of Christ. Big difference there.
Right. Now, on Orkney at 3600 BC, we have what looks like the instructed tradition the Dogon are talking about. And around 2600 BC, suddenly sites on Orkney are abandoned, and it's clear that some of the people on Orkney move south. We have positive connections between Orkney and Stonehenge at 2600 BC. We have a house at Durrington Walls that is an architectural match for one of the houses at Scarborough in the same era. We have any number of elements that positively tie the stonework at Stonehenge, the original stonework at Stonehenge, to Orkney. Now, so those groups that moved south into the lower UK by around 700 AD. Okay, these are groups that are associated with the serpent as a symbol. This is the serpent tradition. Around 700 AD, we have St. Patrick banishing the serpent.
Yes.
And in Ireland, you have a mythic perspective in Ireland that the serpents left. One perspective is they left by boat across the Western Sea. The other perspective is they left and went to the underworld.
Well, what's interesting is that Ireland never had any snakes to begin with.
Yes.
Oh, poor Laird's lagging again.
Audio.
Its audio keeps cutting in and out.
Audio again, yeah.
And he doesn't know.
That migration is the one that ended up in New Zealand. But we can see influences on any number of Native American tribes in that same passage of era. You know, the Cherokee and the Hopi. We see influences that extend down into Central and South America, the Olmecs and so forth.
Yes, they all.
The Polynesian traditions. So this is all part of the same set of migrations from my point of view. And it's the Hopi, I don't know if you know who Gary David is.
Yes.
But he and I communicate fairly regularly about practices the Hopi observe or words they have, or traditions or concepts or symbols that they have that align very, very well, very consistently with the Dogon traditions. Okay, now.
Oh, interesting. I have a question then, Laird, because you just
Okay.
mentioned about the Hopi and the Dogon and the traditions and their everything. And as far as, because I'm kind of familiar with the Hopi prophecy and how that worked. And they had a very particular star alignment that was going to happen as far as their prophecies that recently just came about in September 2017, and it was a star alignment that didn't happen for thousands of years. And I wonder if they would have the same star alignment within the two cultures. I wonder about the prophecies. I wonder, did the Dogon have a certain setup or alignment of stars that had to do with the end times or the prophecies of coming, like the Hopis with the red and the blue kachina? Do you know?
There's a lot of overlap between the Hopi kachina, the dances and the dress and things like that align with the Dogon traditions, but I'm not aware of the Dogon don't emphasize prophecies, even though astronomical bodies and constellations and so forth are significant to them, not in the same way as to the Hopi, but you have common cliff dwelling traditions in both cultures. You have the common practice of periodically sending out a priestly group to relocate itself in some remote location, sort of as making a backup copy of the tradition that would be protected because of its distance from everybody else. You have the deliberate placement of sites on the ground to reflect important star groups in the sky. You have a lot of things, a lot of individual words that also overlap. But the Dogon don't emphasize prophecy in the same way. The Dogon divination is done primarily, what they have like two different forms of it that are very, very sort of localized and are primarily the domain of diviner priests who draw in the sand and interpret things based on tracks of animals that cross the drawings they make in the sand, things like that. But as far as the shifting of traditions, or the shifting of time in eras over the course of the 12,000 years, probably the most tangible example we have of that actually being a thing is the common fairy tradition that we have in all the Celtic cultures, no matter how remote they were. And New Zealand shares the same structure, the fairy mound structure that Ireland has. It has many of the same aspects of the fairy tradition that Ireland has.
That's just going to say, can we talk about that before you leave?
It's interesting. It's interesting that even in my own Slavic tradition, we have a rich tradition of fairies and these types of beings. We have like a whole set of them.
Well, I think Mandy even showed in Australia some of the rock art showing the spirit fairy beings.
Well, let's put it this way. I'm in the Northwest Pacific of Canada, and just down the road for me is called Fairy Forest, okay? Right. I mean, you know, and there's mounds here and everything. I have them on the Crystal Network, Teresa, and I'm up in Canada, way up in the Northwest, and it's all the same thing.
Well, to my way of thinking, the fairies are a tangible example of a shifting time frame that affects the perceptions of humanity.
Yes, and can we say the same thing about could we possibly say the same thing about the Greys today, Laird?
Yes, as a matter of fact, we can. Okay, one of the important things, if we're talking about a progressive slowing of time since what Big Bang theorists are calling the Big Bang.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we can demonstrate that progressive slowing of time because the question arises, how is it that what was emitted in that era as gamma rays, we now perceive as microwaves? There's been a progressive extension of the wavelength of that light. And so a pivotal question is, how do we explain that progressive extension of the wavelength of light? Well, the way the Dogon explained that is, it's reflective of a progressive slowing of the pace of time. Mm-hmm. That's one of the indicators that what the Dogon are saying is objectively correct. Another indicator is the perception that the expansion rate of the universe is quickening. That from the Dogon perspective, what we're seeing is the effect of our own progressive slowing of time frame. That the universe isn't expanding ever more quickly. Our frame of reference has been slowing down. And so when we look out, it looks to us as if the further out we go, the quicker it's expanding. It's not. Time is running more quickly.
It's also interesting to note that, for example, in my language, which is Czech, the word for fairy is vila, V-I-L-A. The word for force or power is sila, S-I-L-A. So
Okay.
it's very similar.
Mhm.
And usually in my language, it's the rule of thumb is if something sounds similar, it is similar. Like, for example, the word we were talking about snakes, the word for snake is had, H-A-D, had. The word for poison is yed, J-E-D.
Right.
Very
So
similar.
you
Right.
got the Vila Sila,
Vila and Sila.
you
Yeah,
got the fairy power,
very
the
powerful.
fairies, that's
Well,
right.
you would say Sila Bili because you have to have a different declension of the objective case,
Mm.
which you don't have in English. So
Now there's a related
In New Zealand-
concept that is very important that maybe I can insert here. There was a researcher by the name of, let's see, lost his name. He his focus was on the energetics of stone cairns. John, lost name for the moment. He did comprehensive scientific studies of stone cairns and the energetics of them, and with focus on eventually on Stonehenge and places like that. And his perspective was that these were sites that people would bring their agricultural seeds to enhance them before they planted them. That the energetics were such that they enhanced the productivity of the seeds. Now, in his book, he documents these sites fairly extensively and often includes photographs. And incidentally, in a number of the photographs, he happened to catch pictures of orbs of light inside these cairns. These were orbs that he said were not there, not visible to the eye when he was physically in the cairn, but they kept turning up on photographic film.
Yeah.
Okay, so his perspective was that the orbs were were sort of incidental to they were an incidental aspect of these cairns. From the Dogon perspective, it's the opposite of that. What the cairns do for the Dogon is they foster a set of energetics that are conducive to the orbs,
Agriculture.
and the orbs
Mhm.
that are responsible for the fertility and productivity of the
We
seeds.
actually wanted to have you on for a show about that. I took down all of your
actually, there
postings.
was a there
Mhm.
was
Yeah.
there was a Czech researcher who did scientific measurements of all the standing stones in Czech Republic, and he discovered that every single one of them has a voltage coming off it, and that it's stronger on its northern side than it is on its southern side.
These are set of discontinuities in the energetics of the ground. John
Yes.
Burke is the researcher. Burke.
Yeah.
When I take some of these orbs, Laird, when I take photographs of other people's photographs or even my own and blow them up and change the light frequency ever so slightly, I'm not talking about a major overhaul, but just change some of the tint, some of the saturation, some of the shadowing and black point, I can see the features and the faces inside of these orbs. And so, as fairies were often seen, everybody remembers Peter Pan, the
Right.
modern, the little sparkling orbs, to show fairies are around.
Also, shifting time frames is an intimate aspect of the fairy tale, the fairy stories. You might be familiar with the story of Rip Van Winkle.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. It wasn't Hawthorne. It was one of the early American writers was the guy who wrote Rip Van Winkle. His father, Washington Irving, his father was from Orkney.
Oh.
And there's a time factor in that. Rip Van Winkle falls asleep, is taken with the fairies. When he comes back, enormous amounts of time have passed.
Uh-huh.
Mhm.
Uh-huh.
All the people he knew were dead. So now there's another aspect to the orbs that is very important in that the Dogon also have the concept of the
I
orb.
know. Mhm.
And the orbs have pertinence for each of these domains of energy I'm talking about that differentiate the 14 domains of energy, and they connect all the way back to the source. Remembering that the same energetics that produce matter also produce consciousness. And so when you get down to that root state of energy, you also get down to a root consciousness that is not deified by the Dogon.
Right, right.
It's treated as a consciousness. Now, the orbs for the Dogon that are responsible for the fertility of the seeds have a name in the Dogon language that literally means to send, to say hello is what it means. To send to greet or to send to say hello. These are orbs who they're treated as messenger orbs that carry information back and forth between our domain and the root domain. So those absolutely connect to concepts of the fairy tradition in various cultures. I have books on the fairy tradition in the Faroe Islands to go way back, or in Iceland.
But didn't you propose at one point that gosh, I don't want to use the wrong term, etymology, no. The original concept of the fairies may have evolved out of the actual size of certain people of the pygmy population in,
or even the Denisovan,
Well,
the pre-humanoid Denisovan people.
The Dogon teachers are described as having originally been non-material, and the name for those teachers is Nomo, which in the Egyptian hieroglyphic language is Numa, or waves
Numa.
proceed.
Oh.
Now, another of the Dogon terms for these orbs is Numo. So there are three classes of these orbs, and one of those classes is the one that they connect to having materialized to teach humanity in the era of 3600 BC.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
And there's a perspective from which all of these states of energy are natural phase transitions of energy, the same way water automatically changes to ice if you lower the temperature enough. There's a perspective from which if you slow the time frame enough for energy, of energy, that you automatically materialize it as a living form, or as one of the forms that we're familiar with. That these are natural phase transitions of a previous state of energy. Now, the Egyptians quantify for us what the pace of time is in each of those domains. And the one that's immediately below ours is identified by the number 10. These are all factors of 10. So the image that they use for the number 10 is an upside down U. It's a picture of a gate. And the idea is that under the right conditions, life forms in that domain of energy can cross over into our domain of energy. Just the same way that a whale can cross through all the biological zones of the ocean. There's certain life forms that can't, but there are other life forms that can. So you imagine a fish swimming along in the upper layer of the ocean, and they see a boat go by. What do they see? The effect they see is pretty much parallel to what we see with the UFO. They see a sort of an oval shape sticking down through the water that appears and disappears and moves at incredible speeds and can do things that can't possibly be done underwater.
Yeah,
That's
I
an
see
excellent
strange.
parallel.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, that is good analogy.
I see strange things and visions and dreams that seem so familiar yet so bizarre. And so I'm thinking this shift of the two different energies that are going on right now in this environment, you know, about the two energy pathways, if you will, or spirals that we are entering or have been involved in and getting more and more involved in, a shift that is more like the original teaching, because we're understanding these things. We're understanding and talking about these things like we have memories of them, and like it's something new, but it's not new. It's something that was been known since the beginning of time. What we've been doing is getting all sucked into all this other technology and the aliens, and you know that's been our model, if you will, a conscious collective thought. But now half of us are, at least half of us are shifting and remembering these things, that what the true meaning of these symbols are, and the energy. We're starting to feel the energy and remember it in our practices. How is
Right.
it that we know how to use the tools that we're using if we've never been formally trained?
Yeah, it's actually, there's actually more parallels of the alien phenomenon to fairies and to these
Mm-hmm.
types of beings than any evidence for space aliens.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, because
Well,
why
you
would the
remember
space aliens be humanoid looking?
right. Well, there's a fairly good chance that they might be, because biology evolves in particular forms. And so there's a fairly high likelihood that under the same conditions that the same forms would emerge, or
Well,
very similar.
Laird, we've run a couple hours here, and as always, we could go on for a millennium with you, but we're going to be doing a series on energy exchange, a whole
Yes.
series of programs, and one of those, I was going to reach out to you anyway to discuss the orbs in more detail, and the crop circles, and some of the earth energy communication. Maybe Earth is trying to communicate with us through these crop circles, but when these orbs show up, they create a certain amount of magnetism that allows that to occur. And it goes back to a lot of the dream stories and a lot of the creation work that these orbs did way back when. So we want to have you back on for one of those discussions and get a little bit further into this with you. It's fascinating, just fascinating.
I'm happy to come back on anytime. It's always a pleasure to talk with people who are so well informed and bring so many different perspectives to the table.
Well, I feel like we just barely touched on this whole Maori tonight because there's so much to it. And Gary, I don't know if you got what you came for this. If there's anything you want to add or would like to discuss in the future, if we do a part 2 about it. So, what are your thoughts? How do you feel about tonight?
Yeah, really cool. These lots of traditions in New Zealand, and a lot of it's through just storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, like there was one where a Maui. So it's you have Maui, and so
Uh-huh.
he was like a demigod. So the sun was going over the planet too fast, and there was a stage that because they believed that the sun came out of the ground, so and it wasn't in space; it was actually in space. So in our universe here, so it came out of the ground. So they wanted to slow the sun down. So they did a travel with his 4 brothers, and they got flaxes and tied ropes, and Maui he casted spells over it so it wouldn't burn because it was really hot. And they travelled out to the desert to see where the sun came up, and they found a big hole and they waited there. So when the sun came out, they threw the ropes over the sun, and Maui went up and beat the sun up. Told him to slow down, and that's how the time slowed down.
But you mentioned 3 brothers, and that's another symbology that you find in a lot of cultures, including my own, including the Slavic culture. You have the legend of the 3 brothers.
3 brothers.
Yeah. So Maui was a demigod. Yeah, even in the islands,
Oh.
they have
Right.
Yeah, and then there's
Maui
the
as
story
well.
of the 7
So it's interesting
canoes.
that in New Zealand.
What's that about, Gary?
The
The
7
story
canoes.
Mhm.
I'm not sure on the 7 canoes, so I can't comment on the 7 canoes.
It's like a dream story, isn't it, Laird?
Yeah,
Well,
I'm not sure about that one.
The names of the 7 canoes have cosmological meaning. I have a chapter in my book about it. I can't remember off the top of my head what each one is, but when you examine the language, the names of the canoes in the Maori language and compare it to the other language sources I have, you realize that they're talking about they're also symbolic of anytime you're talking about certain numbers, they're cosmological numbers, and so you can almost anticipate what the subject matter is.
Yeah. They have different designs for the different planets around our solar system. So they didn't have any telescopes in those days, but they certainly
Well, we
About-
posted the story of the 7 canoes on the Crystal website under more of the story for this program tonight. And it does break it down, but they're different cycles of, they have different meanings about your spiritual development, level of spiritual knowledge and development. Each one of the canoes represents something, but it's part of their creation. It's a dream. I think it's a dreamtime story.
Mm.
And the other thing
that
is,
one, I'm not sure about that one. Yeah.
the other thing, Gary, is I'm gonna see if I'm pronouncing this right. Hong, H-O-N-G, the tradition of grabbing someone's forehead and touching their foreheads.
Hongi.
Represent Honi? How you spell that?
Hongi.
H-O-N-I?
Hongi.
Honi?
Yeah, hongi. Yeah. So it's connecting your eyes with
Third eye, yeah.
each other. So you're connecting.
The third
and
eye.
rub
So
your
it's a very
noses.
spiritual
Yeah,
meaning, but it
so-
also, they breathe through the nostrils. So they blow their breath into your nostrils. Too bad if they're wearing these masks today, but they breathe air through their nostrils into yours. It's a representation of the creation story of Father Sky, Mother Earth, and how he breathed life into her. So when they greet you like that, it's done between very close relatives, loved ones, neighbors that you have utmost respect for. You don't just grab anybody off the street and grab their forehead. It has
No,
a
you don't,
very
yeah.
significant meaning and connection,
Yeah.
deep spiritual connection.
Deep
And if they
spirit,
do
yeah.
that with you, it's because they've recognized in you
Mm.
that light, that energy, that spirituality. And so they
Yeah.
will come to you and grab your head. So I just thought that was fascinating that they're still practicing that. Because that's
Yeah,
been
yeah,
one of the
absolutely.
traditions.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when you go on a marae, you have to be welcomed on to the marae. You can't just go on a marae. You have to be welcomed. Otherwise, the spirits will come after you.
Yeah.
Yeah. And if you play up on the marae, they're very spiritual. If you play up on the marae, which I did, and you get punished for it, and, which I did.
Well, we would love to
yeah.
have you back on sometime too, Gary, to share some of these stories and
Oh,
some
I'd
of
like
these
to hear more
cultural. Wouldn't you like to hear them too, Laird? Yeah.
Mhm.
Do a part 2 of this or of Maori dealing with some of the actual practices and cultural systems that they still have in place and traditions that they're still honoring. Would be wonderful.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they really condemn the Māoris as savages. And
I know.
They were highly advanced, and the English, they had big problems with the English had big problems with them because they were awake. Yeah, they knew what they did. Yeah.
Well, that's another period of time. I mean, they happened at different. It happened in our North American Indian heritage. It happened in Australia. Something horrible. The settlers, these people came in and treated everything from a paradigm of Christianity and programming deep within, Satan. Anything that was out of their circle was satanic.
Yeah.
And they totally tried to wipe out, other cultures. So, and they succeeded.
Yeah. They did. They really succeeded in destroying the Māori culture. Absolutely. Yeah. And everything in around New Zealand, because like the South Island and the North Island went through a stage of actually going underwater and then popping back up. So
Right.
they have that as well.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're just about run out. Sorry to cut you off, Gary, but we would love to have you back to talk about more of that. And Laird, you're more than welcome to join us on that. We'll try to get something set up.
That'd be fun.
Yeah. So, all right. Thank you, everyone. And this has been a wonderful conversation. And we'll catch you next time.
Okay,
thank
bye,
you.
everybody. Bye.